Once you get a Bible, you can open up to Philippians chapter 1, and we are going to pick it up at verse 12 with our third main division in the chapter, which is profitable problems. Profitable problems is what we come to. I'll show you real quickly how I broke the chapter down. Never mind that verses 1 through 11 up at the top. That was from last week's study. But we saw people in verses 1 and 2, the people that were involved, Paul and Timothy and the Philippians. And then we saw prayer and how what motivated Paul to pray, and then how he prayed, the things that he asked for on behalf of the Philippians. And tonight we get into a section titled Profitable Problems. There's no way we are going to get through all of those verses 12 through 30. So I am aiming for verses 12 to 18 tonight. Verses 12 to 18 is what we are aiming for, and I'll show you here, which is that verses 12 to 18 is called the furtherance of the gospel. So we're in the third main division. The third main division is called profitable problems. And then within that, we are going to see the furtherance of the gospel. We're going to see how problems can profit the gospel, really, how they can be profitable. The main goal in life for the overwhelming majority of people seems to be the avoidance of problems. From our earliest years, we are trained to do all that we can to avoid problems. We plan our education, our jobs, and even our retirement, all with the main goal of avoiding problems at all costs. As a result of this, our lives oftentimes suffer. We are often so paralyzed by the fear of problems that we are willing to end valuable relationships instead of fixing the problems. We quit good jobs instead of facing the issues. We break ties with precious church family because it seems easier to start attending a new church rather than to deal with the problems. This results in feelings of failure and frustration and even loss. Add to this the fact that we miss the opportunity to grow and to see God's power on display as we trust Him and face those problems instead of running away from them. Charles Swindoll, a Bible teacher, said, "Every problem is an opportunity to prove God's power. Every day we encounter countless golden opportunities brilliantly disguised as insurmountable problems." Many of us have heard, we're familiar with pro footballer Leo Messi. He was born and he realized very early on, as well as everybody else, that he had the problem of being very, very short in stature. But this actually became his greatest motivation, as many of you know. When he realized he was too small to compete with and go through bigger players, he perfected the skill of going around them at lightning speeds, making him, in the opinion of many, the greatest player in the history of the sport. Problems are something that we oftentimes run away from. What we will see in these verses is Paul facing those problems, and he seems to even enjoy the problems. And we'll see what benefits there are from these problems that Paul is facing. It begins in verse 12, where I told you we are going to be looking at the furtherance of the gospel. It says there in verse 12, "But I want you to know, brethren," as he writes to the Philippians, "that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel." Now, what things is he talking about? Well, he's talking about being arrested and what led to that arrest. If you did not know, Paul, as he's writing this letter to the Philippians, this is one of his prison epistles, one of his prison letters. He's writing from prison. Their favorite Bible teacher, the one that went into Philippi and many years before and started the church, or that God used to start the church there, is now in prison. He's got a prison ministry. Here he is, and there he sits. And so he's saying that everything that led up to that and his imprisonment, that's what he means in verse 12 by the things which happened to me. Now, there are things that happened to him. These are not things that he necessarily chose. He didn't want these things to happen to him, but they happened to him. He's in prison at this point in his life for preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. he preached the gospel. The same thing that I am doing right now landed Paul in prison. And he had been through lots of trouble up to that point. And now here he is writing to the Philippians, and he's on or in house arrest. He's in a home, but he's under arrest, and he's actually chained to Roman guards that they would change. They would swap out. The Roman guards would swap out after several hours of being on their shift, but they would have to be chained to Paul for several hours. That's how his life was being lived. And so he says, the things which happened to me, notice what he says, have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. And then what we would reply with the question, actually? And he would say, yes, actually. Actually, they've turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Now, before we get into the ways that it furthered the gospel, let me share something with you here. It's interesting. I love this. The word furtherance right there in verse 12. And some of you that have been here before, you know that I get all weird about words, get all focused in, locked in on one word or two words or phrases. This is a wonderful, what he's saying here is that word furtherance is the term or the phrase pioneer advance. This was a word that was used for Roman workers who would build Roman roads so that the military could go from one place to another. These are workers that would literally cut a path through a forest. And you're talking ancient times without, chainsaws and electric and gas-powered equipment. You're talking by hand. And so the idea of the furtherance of the gospel, what Paul is saying there is that the things that have happened to me, this trouble that I'm in for preaching the gospel, have actually created new inroads. There's new roads for the gospel to travel on. What an incredible thought. Now, how did that happen? Verse 13, he tells us here. In verse 13, here's the first of our, it's really what this is a sub point, I guess you might call it, because our sub point is the furtherance of the gospel, because our main division is profitable problems. And those profitable problems, how did they profit? Well, they furthered the gospel. That's how they're profitable. And here's another subpoint to go under our subpoint, and that is that it has become evident to everyone, he says in verse 13, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard. Now, we'll talk about what's become evident. We'll talk about the rest of it in just a moment, but the word evident means to manifest. It means to make plainly known. It was revealed. People saw that. They understood. What did they understand? Verse 13. It has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. Now notice he says my chains. He was literally chained up. Literally chained, and was not able to just go and do as he pleased. Now, you and I might think, what's the big deal? So he was chained to Roman guards, and, but he's in a home and he gets to eat. In my strange mind, the first place I go to is, how did the man go to the bathroom? Chained up to two guards. And if I was the Roman guard, before I got chained up to him, my shift, I'd be like, dude, did you go to the bathroom? Or like, why do you always got to wait to go to the bathroom when I'm chained to you? What's the deal here? But he's not able to just come and go as he pleases. No freedom, or very little freedom. And yet, he says, man, this is a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Well, because it's become evident. He's going to name three different people between verses 13 and 14. But in verse 13, he names the first two groups of people. Notice what he says. So it has become evident to the whole palace guard. The whole palace guard. We're talking Roman soldiers here. And then he mentions, and to all the rest. Now, it's only my assumption that when he says, and to all the rest, he's talking about all the rest of the people that are in the palace, or all the rest of the guards that were not necessarily guarding him, but they're there. What he's saying is, it's become evident to everyone. Well, what has become evident to everyone? That his chains are in Christ. The emphasis is not on his chains, as if his chains were special. What he's saying is, it's become evident to everybody here, it's plainly known that I'm here for preaching the gospel, for preaching Christ. So, how was the gospel furthered by these problems? Well, everybody is hearing the gospel. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being chained? You're a Roman guard, or you're a guard, and you've got to guard Paul the apostle. And here you come for your 6-hour shift, chained to this man, and you come in and you see this little bald man there, you know, with a big nose and crooked legs, and there he is, and then what does he say to you? Hi, what's your name? My name's Paul. You know anything about Jesus? Oy vey, 6 hours of this, really? Now I got to sit down as a Roman guard and listen to this guy. I mean, I'm sure that there were some of the Roman guards that were thinking, sergeant or whoever was in command, commander, please send me out anywhere else to do anything else. Please don't send me into that man. But evidently there were some who were hearing the gospel and getting saved. So it's become evident to the whole palace guard. So everyone is hearing the gospel. All of the palace guards and everybody else that he was coming into contact with, everybody else that was there. Everybody was hearing the gospel. So these problems that Paul was facing, or that he was in, that he was surrounded by, I mean, he's up to his eyeballs in these problems. He's saying they furthered the gospel. Because how was he going to go and preach the gospel to those palace guards? They were never going to listen to him, and all the rest. How was he ever going to be able to do that unless he got arrested and went to prison to go and talk to them? What an incredible thought. What an incredible thought. I have always loved the story of Jesus when it said that he had to go through a specific land, and the reason that he had to go through that land was he had to go talk to one lady. It changed her life. What an incredible thought. That he had to go through that land in order to talk to that lady, in order to preach the gospel, because how else was she ever going to hear the gospel? How else were these prison guards ever going to hear the gospel? And so you and I might be facing problems, difficulties, but what we need to do is take our eyes off of ourselves and see opportunities for the spread of the gospel. Here I am. I don't like where I'm at. I don't think that Paul liked where he was at, imprisoned, chained. I'm sure he'd rather be out, going and spreading the gospel, different cities or wherever he wanted to go, but there he is. And as he's there, he begins to look around and realize that he literally had a captive audience. They thought that they had Paul held captive. In reality, the guards were held captive. And Paul was able to preach to them. What a neat thought. And so Paul here, we see that his mindset is different from many of us. There's no avoidance of problems. He's there. There's nothing he can do about it, really. But he sees this problem as an opportunity. As an opportunity. Now, how else did it profit? How else were these problems profitable? Well, it furthered the gospel because it became evident to everyone as Paul was there preaching the gospel. But the next thing that it did was, in verses 14 down to verse 18, was that it encouraged evangelism. Verse 14, he mentions the third group of people. In verse 13, remember, he mentioned the palace guard and to all the rest. And then in verse 14, he mentions another group. And most of the brethren in the Lord, that's the Christians, having become confident in or by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. It does something to us, doesn't it? When we see someone boldly proclaiming Jesus, making a stand for Jesus, even if they are being persecuted, taunted, teased, still, them just standing up boldly, it stirs within us. It stokes a fire within us. And then we go, man, I should be living the same way. You might open up a book, Fox's Book of Martyrs, some of the other books that we have with testimonies of Christians from ages past who made these incredible stands for Christ. And then we go, man, that's firing me up. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to, even if I have to suffer, I'm ready to do it. They did it. I can do it. I want to do it, Lord. So that's the effect that it was having here on most of the brethren in the Lord. This is a crazy thought. Because you would think as the government, as a politician, as a leader, a political leader, you might go, you know what? We got to shut that guy up, get him, lock him up, put him in prison, and that way the rest of all of these weird Christians, they'll stop preaching too. So you get the guy, you lock him up, you put him away, and then the next thing you know, you wake up the next morning and there are more. Then you get up the next morning and there are more. And they keep multiplying, and you go, what's the deal? We locked the guy up. You would have thought that it would have scared everyone, and yet what it did was it fired everybody else up. You know, the most effective thing that the world could ever do to us in order to get us to stop living for Christ, in order to get us to stop preaching the gospel, is to make things as easy as they can for us. We do not thrive in ease. That's not effective for us. President Theodore Roosevelt said, never throughout history has a man who lived a life of ease left a name worth remembering. Now, you and I are not concerned with our names being remembered, but we want the promotion of Christ. We want everyone to know about Jesus. But in order for that to happen, the best thing that could ever happen to us in order to cause that to flourish would not be a life of ease where we just have all the freedom we want. We grow lazy with freedom, but it's actually in difficulties, it's in hardships, it's in problems and facing those problems. It encouraged evangelism in verse 14. They were much more bold to speak the word without fear. He says in verse 15, some indeed preach Christ. Now this is a strange section here. Verse 15, some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. Now what is he saying there? He said that within that group of brethren in the Lord, that there are some who are preaching with the wrong motivation. He says they're preaching from envy. Notice what he said, they preach Christ, but they're doing it from envy and strife. Envy is the feeling of discontent due to my desire to have what someone else has. We oftentimes confuse envy and jealousy. They are two different things. We've talked about that before. Envy and jealousy are two different things. Jealousy is the fear of losing something that belongs to you. Thus, God is a jealous God. Not that God is, living, in fear, but he does not want to lose what's his. What's his? Us. Envy is wanting what someone else has and wanting them not to have it anymore. Again, envy is a feeling of discontent due to my desire to have what someone else has. Strife there is contention. It's fighting. So some indeed preach Christ from envy and fighting. They're envious and they fight. And we go, what? Well, I don't understand. Why would they be preaching Christ? What's going on? Well, we'll find out what Paul says about it in verse 16. But then he mentions verse 15 at the end, and some also from goodwill. Some with good motivations. So there were some preaching Christ with bad motivations, and then there were some preaching Christ with good motivations. Now, we would tend to say, well, if they had bad motivations, then, they're bad, and we should just, let's get rid of them. But note what Paul goes on to say, verse 16. The former, that's the ones that are preaching from envy and strife, preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. So we understand that there was a group of people that saw Paul imprisoned, and then they thought, oh, finally, Paul the apostle, him and his bald head, off to prison. Now I can be the preeminent preacher. Now I can be the one in the spotlight. And so out of envy and out of strife, they decided, I'm going to be the top preacher. Let me get out there and let me really preach. They were envious of Paul. Envious because of the ministry that he had, because of what God was using him for. And when they saw him put away, they said, hey man, Paul's out of the picture. Let's get out there and let's start preaching it up, and maybe we can get our name in lights. Maybe we can, get some of that thunder. Now maybe everybody will look to us as, the main teacher. So the former preached Christ. Notice their motivation from selfish ambition. Selfish ambition, that phrase there means, and we're in the season for it, electioneering. Electioneering. Self-promotion. It's being a politician. And we, over the last couple of days, have seen lots of this. Lots of this. There are many people that are excited about the new president and his cabinet and all the changes that are being made, and there are lots of people who are very, very angry and upset about it. It's hard for me to watch either way, because electioneering and self-promotion leaves such a bad taste in my mouth. I don't care to see people self-promoting all over the television or all over my phone or all over my news feed. But that's what's happening. It's electioneering. So when he says that the former preach Christ from selfish ambition, what he's talking about is there's a group of people that are preaching Christ. They're preaching Christ, but they're doing it with the wrong motivation. Their motivation is selfish, and they are ambitious for their own promotion. So they're trying to promote themselves by preaching Christ. And then he says at the end of verse 16, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. Let's preach it up. Let's steal Paul's thunder. Whoever it was that was listening to him, now that he's gone, they'll now listen to me, and now I can preach, and I can be the top dog, the big kahuna, the big cheese, la barriga, the big one, the main one. And you know what? They can keep Paul in prison even longer, and who cares about him now that he's off the scene? It was all about them. La barriga, that's the big gut, man. That's the boss. Like, oh, I'm in charge. I don't do nothing. Selfish ambition. They were actually motivated by selfish ambition. And this is going to blow your mind what Paul says about it. Because again, we would go selfish ambition, preaching Christ. Oh, wrong motive. No, get out of here. But note what Paul says in verse 17. But the latter, the other group, they're preaching out of love, out of agape. Knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. They understand. They understand that I've been appointed to this position. Appointed to what, Paul? Appointed to be a prisoner. Appointed to that position by God. In other words, what Paul is saying is, God orchestrated this, that Paul should be in prison in order to preach to those Roman guards so that they could hear the gospel, because who else was going to share it with them? Paul was willing to do that. And he was doing it with the right motives, the right attitude, the right heart, the right mindset. And there was this group of Christians in verse 17 that understood that, and they were preaching, being motivated by love. Verse 18, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense, that means with false motives, your phony, fake motives, or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. You see what Paul said there at the end in verse 18? He says it doesn't matter if there's a group of Christians that are preaching with the wrong motives. They're envious, they're striving, they're self-ambitious. That he says that doesn't matter, because the message that they're preaching is the right message. So these teachers, though they had the wrong motives, they had the right message. And Paul says, I'm okay with that. They may have the wrong motives. Paul's probably thinking, God will take care of that. He'll judge their motives. It's God that judges the motives. But the message was the message of Christ. It was the truth. And he says, I'm glorifying God for that. So whether it's in pretense, false motives, or whether it's with true motives, Christ is being preached. And in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. Isn't that incredible? In this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. You know what that's called? In verse 16, we had selfish ambition. In verse 18, I call that, Paul's attitude, selfless ambition. Those that had the wrong motives had selfish ambition. They were doing it for selfish reasons. Paul says, I don't care. The gospel's being preached. Now that does not, let me tell you what Paul's not saying. Paul is not saying that they had the wrong message. He was not okay with that. These teachers did not have the wrong message. They had the right message, wrong motives. Paul was okay with that as long as the message is getting out. Now, we might turn on YouTube or somewhere else and see a Bible teacher. We ought to examine them first before we get excited and say, what is their message? We don't know what their motives are. Maybe we can tell their motives, or maybe we have some idea by their actions or the things that they say. But what we want to be focused on is the message itself. We can't judge the motives, but what we can do is judge the message. Is the message biblical? Is it according to God's word? If so, thank God. But if the message is false, we ought not be thanking God for that. We ought not be rejoicing over that. That's not what Paul was doing. Paul wasn't rejoicing over a false message. The message was true. The motives were wrong. That's what you call a selfless ambition. And that's what you and I want to have, a selfless ambition. Where, yeah, we're ambitious, but not for my own glory, not for my own promotion. I'm ambitious for the glory of God and for the promotion of Jesus and the gospel. That's what I want. I want to be like Paul and say, you know what, these are problems, but they're profitable problems. And I want to look at it the way Paul did, and I'm going to go, you know what, the gospel is actually being furthered, even though I'm in prison, and I don't want to be in prison, but even though I'm in prison, this is a good thing, because the gospel is being furthered. You and I, we want to look at problems that way. We want to look at problems not as just problems, but these are opportunities for God to work, for God to show his wisdom, to show his power. It's not about me. What has helped me over the years is to, when I'm facing a problem, take a step back from it. Sometimes literally, depends on, I might be working on something at home. And there are times when I get frustrated and I just got to take a step back. Every single week, for all of these years that I have been teaching the Bible, I always come to hard parts in my study time, where I come to some challenging place, and then I get, my mind gets, it gets frustrated real quickly. And oftentimes I just have to take a step back. And sometimes I take a step back. I know this is so godly. Sometimes I take a step back and I play Tetris for a few minutes. Like old school, 80s. Tetris for a little bit, and then, okay, enough, turn that off, and okay, I'm gonna go outside and water my plants, or I'm gonna go outside and walk the dog, or I'm gonna go take whatever, and then I come back, fresh eyes, okay, let me look at it. But oftentimes taking a step back from the problem and looking at it from a different angle, the better view, oftentimes I'm able then to figure out, okay, this is a problem, but I see a solution. I see how this can be a good thing. And so you and I want to do the same thing. Even with those spiritual problems that we have. Take a step back and go, wait a minute. Let me look at the big picture here. Another thing that I oftentimes do is this. Oftentimes when I'm facing a problem, I will stop and I'll go, you know what? What's the worst that could happen here? What's the worst that could happen? And oftentimes, the first place that people go to, what's the worst that could happen? Well, I could die. Well, that's actually not the worst. Because if I died, I would go to heaven. So that's not the worst that could happen here. So what's the worst that could happen? Well, it depends. If I'm working on my car and I go, man, what am I doing? I don't really know if I know how to do this, but what's the worst that could happen? Well, I could blow my car up or, break it really bad and not be able to repair it. Okay, That would mean I would have to humble myself and have it towed to the mechanic. But I always stop and I look and I go, you know what? Somebody can fix. If I can't fix this, if the guy on YouTube that I'm watching can't help me fix this, there's a mechanic that can fix this. That's worst case scenario. And if I don't have the money, I guess I got to put it on a credit card. I don't really want to do that. I try not to do that. But worst case scenario. And I like to do that. I like to take a step back and look at what's the worst case scenario. And then I go, you know what? It's not that big of a deal. Spiritually, when there are those spiritual problems, I like to take a step back and remind myself, wait a minute, I'm not God. I don't have to figure this out. I belong to God. This is actually God's problem. Let's let God figure it out. And then I can pray, commit it to Him, wait for Him to answer. Then I get to see His power on display. Then I get to see Him glorified. That's much better. So God help us that we would see these problems not just as problems. It's okay to see the problems, but to see them as opportunities for which, in which God can work and display His power. So Father, we thank you so much for your word.